Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. Some of you, especially in USDA Zone 9, where freezing temperatures haven't occurred yet, you just might still have green and partially red tomatoes clinging to life in your backyard garden. The big question is, are they going to ripen? Well, as always, the answer is, it depends. We'll look into that. One listener from Virginia wants to know if that pile of mulch near her maple tree can be moved right now. Her concern, the roots of the tree have invaded that mulch pile and, well, there's a bunch of suspicious stringy white stuff inside that mulch pile as well. We'll start digging into the answer for that one with our favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower. UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden Superintendent Emeritus Warren Roberts tells us all about a perennial that's putting on quite the show right now for many of you, the chrysanthemum. It's our plant of the week. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's episode 152 of the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. And we'll do it all in, well, just a little over 30 minutes. Don't hate me for that. Let's go.
Hi, Farmer Fred. It's Mary in Arlington, Virginia, Zone 7B. I got delivery of shredded leaf mulch way back in the spring, and it was more than I could use at the time, so I just let it sit in a pile. It was about 15 feet away from a red maple. And it sat there all summer long. I haven't even gone near it until today when I went to get some mulch, and I was just stunned to see that the roots of the maple tree had grown up through my mulch pile and encased it in this fibrous root net, like a hairnet on my mulch pile. I tried pulling some of the roots away, and the deeper I got, the thicker the roots got. The thickest I could see were about the size of a marker, but most were skinny, like a pencil, or even skinnier than that. But the vast majority of them were really sticky, white, fibrous, like thread-like roots. So here's my question. I wish I had moved this mulch pile back in the spring, but now I need to move it. Will moving it, and I have to dig it up to move it, which will damage all of this root growth. Will that damage my tree?
Mary, thanks for contacting us via speakpipe.com/garden basics. A very easy way to get your questions into the show and hear your voice here on the podcast. Debbie Flower is here. We hear her voice quite often here on the podcast, and that's a good thing. And Debbie, what Mary is describing sounds like normal mulch growth.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing two things. The thin, sticky white is a fungus that is growing in the mulch that is common, is positive, is helping to break down that mulch and release the nutrients to the plants. Yes, you'll disturb it when you move the pile, but it will recolonize once you spread the mulch where you want it to go.
It's good stuff.
It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Right. The thicker, though, that you talked like a marker, or maybe as thick as a thumb, that could be a root. Mm-hmm. And if it is, it's a feeder root, or it's the extension of a root that will have feeder roots on it of the maple, I presume, since we don't know anything else is around that pile. And you may have to cut that to get the mulch out, or you may just be able to scrape the mulch away from around it. That would expose it, and it would die if it were exposed to light and air. So I would wait until the tree is dormant. That means it has lost its leaves and it has sent all the food that it has made for the season down into the stems and into the roots, and it's storing it there. And if you do have to cut any part of the root off, you're taking off some of that stored food, but you are not doing tremendous damage to the tree. When I say cut, I mean cut. Use a sharp tool and cut the end off, but you don't want to leave it exposed to the surface. If you do that, it will die.
Roots are lazy.
Absolutely.
They're going to go wherever the easiest sources of water and nutrients are. And boy, that layer where the mulch meets the soil can be some of the richest stuff around.
Absolutely, yep. It's got that fungus in it that's breaking down the mulch, releasing nutrients. It's got the nice air that is in a large chunk mulch, and it holds moisture because organic matter holds moisture. It's got everything a root could ever want.
Yeah, I like the idea of waiting till the plant is dormant before you go ahead and move that mulch. This is my big complaint about people who use weed cloth around surrounding trees and shrubs, is that the roots of the plant are going to come up to the surface because that soil right below that plastic weed cloth is going to be moist and it's dark, so the roots don't see a problem.
And the roots will follow in the soil where they get the right amount of moisture and oxygen. I had a tiered backyard at one of my houses, and so I would walk out at one level, go down 3 steps, and I'd be at the second level. Go down, it was more like 6 or 8 steps, and be at the third level. And on that third level, I planted a fruiting mulberry tree. Fruiting mulberry trees have orange roots. I didn't know that till I took the tree out, but they have orange roots. When I was on the second level, the one right above that, about 8 steps above that mulberry, I had the vegetable garden. I was digging in the vegetable garden one day, and I came across the mulberry roots. So the mulberry roots from 8 steps below had followed up under the soil and gone out into the vegetable garden where there was regular moisture for that plant to get. So roots will follow just under the soil surface where they're getting the right amount of oxygen and moisture. And that's where they will live. In a landscape fabric situation, the oxygen is somewhat limited because the oxygen can't penetrate through the fabric like it can penetrate through a mulch or through soil itself. And so those roots have to stay closer to the surface in order to get the oxygen that they need.
Anybody who's owned a mulberry tree and had it in a lawn know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
It's not a fun thing to have in a lawn.
No.
So really, she really doesn't have that much to worry about.
I agree. She just needs to understand that white netted stuff is really good.
And I'm glad she had placed that pile away from the tree. It wasn't piled up against the trunk of the tree. And a lot of people make that mistake, especially in parts of the country where volcano mulching is still a thing.
Right, yes.
And I'm not sure why volcano mulching is still a thing, where you pile up mulch around the base of a plant. Is it for like roses, perhaps?
Well, in cold places that get very, very cold, plants like roses are mulched in winter. Mulch is piled up against the woody portions of the plant, and it's because cold air holds very little moisture. If the part of the rose that is exposed can actually dry out and die. And so I suspect that may be the origin of the idea that woody parts of a plant should be covered in winter with mulch so they don't dry out. However, with trees that are adapted to that environment, that is not necessary. In fact, it can be detrimental.
It would lead to rot.
Yes.
Now, with the roses, it's a case of, okay, you can go ahead and do that, but as soon as the weather starts warming in late winter, move it away.
Yes. Yes.
After all danger of it's really not a danger of frost. It's more of a danger of a hard freeze.
Yes. So you're looking at maybe 30 when it's 30 degrees.
Yeah.
Pick a round number. Yeah.
So when all danger of 30-degree weather has passed, you can go ahead and remove.
And remove that. Right.
Right. But yeah, though the white mycelium growing in the mulch shows a healthy pile of mulch.
Yes.
It's breaking down. It's doing its thing. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole idea there.
Mm-hmm. Providing nutrients to that soil below.
Don't worry, Mary. Be happy. And thanks for contacting us.
Yeah.
Well, Debbie, thanks for putting our maple trees to sleep.
I love maple trees. You're welcome.
Smart Pots. It's the original award-winning fabric planter. It's sold worldwide, and Smart Pots are proudly made 100% in the USA. Smart Pots, by the way, are BPA-free with no risk of chemicals leaching into your soil, your herbs, vegetables, and other edibles. That's why organic growers prefer Smart Pots. And they last for years. Some gardeners have been using the same Smart Pots for over a decade. SmartPot's breathable fabric creates a healthy root structure for plants. Because the fabric breathes, SmartPots are better suited than plastic pots, especially for really hot and really cold climates. And unlike a plastic pot, the fabric won't crack or break from frost or when dropped. For more information, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part, because on that page are details of discounts when you buy SmartPots at Amazon. Visit smartpots.com/Fred. Every week we like to talk with Warren Roberts. He's the Superintendent Emeritus of the UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden. He always has an interesting plant of the week, and right now it's a plant that's putting on a show near you. There are shows presenting these plants. They are very colorful. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They're an amazing family of plants. The chrysanthemum. I don't know where you begin with this one, Warren.
Well, I think I'll begin with the main species from which the chrysanthemums have been derived, and the main species that have been used for making the hybrids, and that's Chrysanthemum indicum, which is native to China. Now, when you look at the chrysanthemum, I think that means golden flower, out of Latin, but indicum means from India. But many botanists use that specific epithet, indicum or indica, to mean China. I don't know why the confusion began, but there it is, and we just have to live with it.
Okay.
So the first recorded planting of chrysanthemums goes back at least 3,500 years in China, and there are now today over 20,000 different kinds available. They go all the way from flowers that look like simple daisies to flowers that look like a spider web. It's just amazing. And each one of the sections of the flower of the chrysanthemum, you call them the petals or the little tiny florets in the middle, each one of those is a separate flower. So what you have is a composite flower. And the name of the family, one of the names of the family includes chrysanthemum, is Compositae. Now, it's also been called Asteraceae, which is another member of the daisy family. A lot of different kinds of chrysanthemum. The distribution is mainly East Asia of the genus Chrysanthemum, particularly in China. Many different kinds of wild chrysanthemums have been recorded.
People here are probably most familiar with what are commonly called florist chrysanthemum, which are perennials and grow throughout the country.
Yes, they do. And if the soil doesn't freeze too hard, they survive. Typically, what I do, I like to have flowers in the house, and my favorite on that would be Alstroemeria, which lasts so long. But occasionally, I'll just buy a pot of chrysanthemum or a cyclamen or something and put it on the table. And then when the flowers are out, I take it outside, clip it, and plant it in the ground. And from where I'm sitting, I can see some beautiful maroon red chrysanthemums that were used for that purpose in the past and bloom again year after year.
What sort of care do they require?
Oh, they don't require much, but keep in mind there are from an area that gets about an inch of rain a week. They do need some irrigation to perform pretty well. And if you don't, maybe they don't die, but they don't look very happy. It is a flower that get a moderate amount of water every 2 weeks or so. It keeps them going. It keeps them happy.
There is a local chrysanthemum society near where you live. There may be a chrysanthemum show and sale that goes on once a year.
Yes, and then if you're sharing from your own garden, once the flowers are gone, you can divide the plant. As long as there's some roots and stem on the division, it's going to do well. Now, several years ago, there was confusion, and it was decided to split up this huge genus Chrysanthemum into other genera. The florist chrysanthemum ended up under the genus Dendranthema.
Oh.
But then botanists thought better of it and put it back to Chrysanthemum. But there are a number of related plants like Chrysanthemum balsamita, which is a mint-flavored chrysanthemum. Not that you'd eat it, but it has a mint. If you rub the leaf, it has a mint-like smell. And the leucanthemum, which are the oxeye daisies, which would include the Shasta daisy, and pyrethrum and tanacetum, the tansies and the pyrethrums, and the pesticide the pyrethrins are derived from a species of chrysanthemums. The use of other chrysanthemums, sometimes tea, you can have chrysanthemum tea from the chrysanthemums that do not have the poison.
Oh.
And also in the Japanese cuisine, tempura, which originally was brought into Japan by the Portuguese, the leaves of some chrysanthemums are dipped in batter and eaten and quite tasty. Regarding the cultural use of chrysanthemums, much of Europe and New Orleans considers chrysanthemum flowers as symbols of somebody's demise. So they're used for funerals. So if you're trying to woo somebody in France, you don't give them a bouquet of chrysanthemums. That would have a bad meaning. And New Orleans.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't do it down there. Yeah,
don't do it there as well. An interesting genus, part of our culture, was brought into the United States when we were still a colony. Being appreciated is they're easy to grow and they're beautiful. What more could you ask?
I would say if you want more information, it would be to go online and check them out.
Yes. For example, Wikipedia, the information goes on and on. Cultural uses about chrysanthemum way beyond what I should be talking about today. But it's still interesting stuff.
Oh, it is. And it's a big family of plants. And I would really recommend that if you do come across a chrysanthemum show when they are in bloom in the fall, is go to it and just marvel at the different sizes and shapes that chrysanthemums can come in.
And even chrysanthemum bonsai, where they look like little old trees with daisies on them.
Oh,
amazing.
My heavens. The chrysanthemum, the plant of the week. Once again, Warren Roberts, Superintendent Emeritus of the UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden, has come through with a great plant for us. Warren, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Fred. My pleasure.
If you're thinking of growing fruit trees, or maybe you already have your own backyard full of fruit trees, well, you probably have a million questions. Like, which fruit trees will grow well where I live? What are the tastiest fruits to grow? How do I care for them? What are the most important things to know when starting a backyard orchard? Well, the good news is those answers are just a click away with the informative videos that you can find at davewilson.com. That's Dave Wilson Nursery, the nation's largest grower of fruit trees for the backyard garden. At davewilson.com, you'll also find planting tips, taste test results, fruit variety recommendations, and links to nurseries in your area that carry Dave Wilson fruit trees. Your harvest to better health begins at davewilson.com. We get questions here at the Garden Basics podcast. Kathy writes in and says, I have a Better Boy tomato that after a lull over the summer started producing again. It's full of green tomatoes in various sizes. Since it looks like the temperatures are going to dip pretty low in the next few days, should I pick the larger ones and let them ripen inside? We would like to know. And this is one of these California problems, Debbie Flower, a retired horticultural professor. And this is something we Californians go through with every October, November, wondering if those green tomatoes out there are going to ripen before the first frost hits, or the second frost, or the third frost. What do you do? Do we just serve up fried green tomatoes, or do those tomatoes that are out there on the vine have a chance in late fall?
Well, first of all, I think it's also a problem for other places, because those tomatoes genetically are a perennial, and if the climate remained warm enough, they would ripen and continue to grow. And so wherever you are, no matter how early your frost comes, if you've got a tomato plant and it's producing fruit, you're going to be faced with this problem as well.
You're absolutely right in that this problem probably hits every tomato grower in America. Just some, it hits them earlier than others, sometimes in September, some in October, others in November or December.
Yes, right. My son lives in Minnesota. They've had snow already. So it's a moot point for them now, but it happened before, happened earlier in the year. So yes, we all go through this. And the tomatoes, I was looking at a friend's tomato plant the other day, and there were some really nice red ones all ready to be picked. And then there are the green ones. And yes, your question is, or the caller's question is, what will happen to those? It depends.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, it does depend. So I guess what one has to do is sort of like take a sample of the tomato and perform an autopsy on it.
Yes, the tomatoes ripen over time, and they start green, and then they progress to red or orange, or depending on stripes, whatever color you have of tomato that you're growing. And so we need to check the maturity of that fruit. If it has matured far enough while it's still on the plant, then you can bring it in, put it on a windowsill, or even there are other you can wrap it in newspaper. Place it. I did them in the basement of one of my houses in a fruit box on a bed, wrapped each one in newspaper. So you can bring them in and they will ripen if they've matured far enough on the plant. And so you have to, as you say, dissect them to find out if they've matured far enough.
So what are the signs you look for? I imagine you kind of slice it open the middle and then you take a look at what's going on the inside.
Right. So a fruit exists on a plant to produce seeds so that the plant can reproduce. And so that's where we're going to look. If the tomato is completely green and we cut it open, then we need to look at the seeds. The seeds on tomatoes, as they mature, develop a gel sort of pillowcase around them, a coating around them. And if the seeds have produced that coating and they sort of push away from the knife as you cut it, then the tomatoes are mature enough to ripen. If when you cut the tomato in half, if you cut right through the seeds or there is no gel coating around the seeds, then they are not ripe enough to continue ripening off the plant.
And I guess too, you look at and see if the seeds move or not as you're cutting through. I noticed that Texas A&M University has some advice that after you slice through the center of the tomato, examine the seed within the fruit. If the seeds are covered with a clear gel, which causes them to move away from the knife, right, then that fruit will eventually turn red and ripen. On the other hand, if the seeds are cut by the knife, then those fruits will never properly ripen.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's an interesting aside, at least for me, is that if you wanted to save seeds from your tomatoes that you grew this year and see what you get from them next year, they're seeds, so they won't be exactly like the parent plant that you just took them from. But what you have to do to get those seeds, prepare those seeds to be able to plant them next year, is get that gel that's around the seeds to ferment off, to expose the seed from that gel. So that gel is a pretty important indicator of maturity of the plant.
And I guess this is something that you cannot put off doing. That is picking up the tomatoes for ripening inside the house, because if a frost does hit, you're shortening the life of those green tomatoes.
Yeah, there are some important temperatures to keep in mind. Fruit development on a tomato plant slows way down based on night temperatures, when night temperatures get in the 40s. So night temperatures in general are very, very important to plant development and maturity. And so if temperatures are going to drop into the 40s, so below 50, then the plant is unable to produce the pigments and the chemicals that allow that fruit to ripen. And so it'll just stall. It'll just stop. So yes, you got to watch those night temperatures and bring those fruit in before they drop too low.
And from what I understand, too, it's a good idea to don't rip the fruit off of the plant, but leave a little bit of the stem, because if you rip the stem out of the fruit, that'll open them up to more decay.
Yes, true. We're taking a fruit that's been growing on a plant outdoors and been exposed to whatever's in the air. And if we make any holes in it, whether we're picking a tomato that has maybe a slug hole or some other kind of browsing hole in it, or we rip that stem out of the top, we've opened the fruit up to the fungus and particularly bacteria that are in the air around the fruit, and it's all downhill from there. You're just going to end up with a whole bunch of mush. So cut the fruit off, don't rip it off.
I guess if you're just going out there to pick the mature green tomatoes, I guess a couple of things to look at: the size of the tomato and any sort of coloration change that might be going on.
Yes, a mature green tomato kind of needs to be defined, right?
Yes.
They're well sized. So we tested whether it was time to pick them by cutting them. So obviously that one tomato is not going to continue to ripen. So now we're going to go out in the garden and look for ones probably of similar size. And we will look at color. If they were green, which all tomatoes are in the beginning, and they're going to become a red tomato, they'll go through a phase where they have turned sort of more white. If they're that color and they're good size, then they have the chance to become red and produce the flavor that we like so much.
And I guess if that tomato is completely green, maybe start looking for others that show some sort of color change.
Yeah, obviously there's going to be some that have gone from green to white, and then they're going to start to become red. And if they've become red and you bring them in and put them in a well-ventilated area, they don't need to be in the sun. As I said, I've done it in the basement. We didn't have windows in the basement, not that produced sun anyway. They will ripen without being in the sun, and you'll have great tomatoes.
What is the proper storage temperature for these mature green tomatoes?
Well, you certainly want something above 50 degrees and below 85. Probably around room temperature would be the best. I don't know about your house, but 65 to 75 degrees. You could probably go lower than that, 60 degrees to 75 degrees. You don't want it too high because then they're going to dry out. You don't want it too cold because then they won't ripen as quickly.
And once that tomato is fully ripe, what is the best storage for a tomato?
Tomatoes should not really be put in the refrigerator, because refrigerators run around 40 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and that will destroy some of the flavor molecules in the tomato. So you want it to be 45 to 50 degrees. In my world, that's a hard temperature to come by. If you've got some kind of maybe a wine refrigerator that you can control, or a special little produce refrigerator where you can raise the temperature a bit higher than what your normal refrigerator is, then you've got the ideal situation. Maybe a
root cellars.
Yes, if you have a root cellar, that might work. But in my house, I don't have any of those things, and so I just leave them on the counter, but not next to the stove, not next to the oven, not near a heat vent. I want them to have good airflow, so put them up on a rack and space them so that air can flow between them. Wrapping them in newspaper can also be used because it helps dissipate the moisture that these fruits are alive, that a live fruit is producing, and it will result in less rot.
I guess, too, then, for the next couple of weeks or so, if they are maturing at room temperature, and probably take about 2 weeks for them to mature, is to check them every few days and find ones that may have gone bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully you get them before they go bad and get to use them, can them, freeze them, dehydrate them, whatever your process is.
And then if you store them right again, build that root cellar while you're waiting and put them in there and they'll last a few more weeks.
Right.
Now, have you ever tried pulling up an entire tomato plant and hanging it upside down in your garage?
I have not. I think once in the past I took some branches and hung them in the garage. It would have been the basement when I had a basement. It just seems like such a messy job to pull up the whole plant and drag roots and dirt and all around inside anywhere of the house, the garage, the basement, wherever. So no, I have not done that.
For those who have tried it, they probably know that you need to avoid sunlight because the tomatoes will spoil and ripen unevenly. And again, that root cellar temperatures would be ideal for that in the 55, 65 range.
They would. And it wouldn't be a big problem to bring the dirt into the root cellar. So, yeah, I envy the root cellar people.
Now, one thing about storing tomatoes, and I think this is a good idea, too, is to store them by color, to have several different cardboard boxes in which to place these tomatoes, and then basically put the ones of similar coloration together because they'll tend to ripen together.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The ones that are redder to begin with are going to ripen first. The ones that are closer to that white-green color are going to be the last ones. And so you look at everything in between. So that would help you organize your harvest.
Now, here's the dirty little secret about doing this. You're not going to get summertime flavor out of that tomato.
No, you won't, but you'll get something that's a lot better than what you find at the grocery store.
There you go. That's our criteria on this program.
Yeah, that's the point, right?
Yes, exactly. So basically, if you do all that, you can extend that to the enjoyment of tomatoes and still keep having BLT sandwiches for a few more weeks or maybe a couple of months.
Right. Thanksgiving's coming. Maybe you can have it then.
Could be. Now, what about fried green tomatoes? I mean, that's just not the title of a movie, too. That's an actual delicacy in some parts of the country.
It is. And I've made that because I've had green tomatoes that I realized were never going to ripen. And they still have good flavor.
They taste like tomato despite all the milk and egg and flour?
It comes through. That little bit of acid. Yeah, it comes through. I like an acidic tomato, so I'm typically growing an acidic tomato.
Okay, and they are fried, correct?
Yes, they are fried.
All right, so there is that. Well, we learned something about extending the tomato harvest, so especially if you're in USDA Zone 9, head out to the yard real soon. Start looking for those green tomatoes that may be turning color, clipping them off, bringing them in, putting them in cardboard boxes, and perhaps enjoying them in a couple of weeks.
Yummy.
Debbie Flower, retired college horticultural professor, thanks for letting us harvest the last of the tomatoes.
Oh, such a pleasure. Thank you, Fred.
If our chat about green tomatoes sounded a little familiar, you are correct. It originally aired back in November of 2020 in episode 63. So what's new this time around? It's the accompanying article in the Garden Basics newsletter. So if you're still curious about the harvesting and ripening of green tomatoes, go beyond the basics in the latest edition of the Garden Basics newsletter on Substack. We'll have pictures of the various ripening stages of tomatoes, along with specific information about whether those will ripen indoors or not. As the Garden Basics newsletter grows, so will the subject matter. So yes, it will be a very good supplement for the Garden Basics podcast, along with a lot more garden-related material. Find it in the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter on Substack. And best of all, it's free. There's a link in today's show notes, and there's a link near the top of the page at farmerfred.com. Or you can just go to substack.com and do a search for Garden Basics with Farmer Fred. That's substack.com/garden basics. Think of it as your garden resource that goes beyond the basics. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter, and for you, it's free. So remember me in your will. Thank you very much. Don't forget, if you want to learn more about the topics covered on today's episode of Garden Basics with Farmer Fred, please subscribe to the free Garden Basics newsletter. It's on Substack. Details are in today's show notes. The Garden Basics podcast will be on its winter schedule from November through January, which means there will only be one episode per week during this 3-month period, and it'll come out on Fridays. Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, and we thank them for their support. Garden Basics, it's available for free wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening, subscribing, and leaving comments. We appreciate it.